Welcome to Torah Today Ministries and our continuing series, Parshah Seasonings, where we look at some of the details coming out of the Hebrew and out of the Torah scroll that are not translated or even footnoted in our English translations. And in this episode, we find ourselves in Torah portion Vayigash, which begins in Genesis 44:18 and goes through chapter 47, verse 27. Well, let's begin with Genesis 44, verse 18. Now, this is where Joseph has all of his brothers with him in Egypt, including Benjamin, and he has brilliantly hidden his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, and as the sons are leaving, the brothers are leaving, he sends a messenger and say, "Hey, who stole my cup?" And they go through the bags and they find it in Benjamin's, and they're thinking, "Oh no." And so they bring them all back. And the stage is set. And now Joseph gets to see, are they going to sell out my little brother Benjamin the way they sold out me? Or have they grown up? Have they learned? And it's indicated that the instigator of selling Joseph was Judah. And now that Benjamin is in trouble, he's been framed, if you will, we see Judah step forward. And Judah beautifully, this time, offers himself as a ransom for Benjamin, for Joseph's younger brother. And at that point, Joseph cannot contain himself any longer, and he sends everyone out of the room, and he reveals himself to his brothers. He brings them around and says, "Ani Yosef, I am Joseph." And they were stunned. That is one scene in the scriptures I would love to be able to get in a time machine, go back and see. I would love to see that. And I'd like to see it over and over again because I know it'll be fresh and powerful every time. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we are, the brothers are there, and Judah now steps forward to appeal to Joseph. He doesn't recognize that this is Joseph, to appeal to him to let Benjamin go home and to keep Judah instead. And it says, "Then Judah went up to him and said, 'O my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's ears. And let not flare up your anger against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself.'" Now that phrase, "let not flare up," in Hebrew is va'al yachar. Va'al yachar. Va'al means "and do not," and yachar means to flare up or to get hot. Now, you find this translated several different ways in English translations because literally what the phrase means is it's va'al yachar and off. Off is your nose. Don't let your nose get hot. That wouldn't make much sense in English. We say things like, "don't get your nose out of joint," which is a weird saying too. But in Hebrew, when somebody gets angry, their nose gets hot. But when someone is self-controlled and patient, they say their nose gets long. And God is described as one who has a long nose because he's patient, he's slow to anger. So Judah says, don't let your nose get hot. But the first two words, va'al yachar, that phrase is found only twice in the Bible. It's found here in this verse, and then it's found in the very next chapter. And this is when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and this is what he says, 45:5. "And now do not be distressed, and va'al yachar, do not be angry with yourselves, because you sold me here." Now, there's something profound going on between these two verses. When God ordains that a certain word or phrase be found and used only in two places, you can rest assured that somehow those two occurrences and the events surrounding those occurrences have something to do with each other. There's a lesson to be learned. It's like two halves of a menorah. When you bring it together, we get more light. So let's look at the first verse again, and then at the second verse. In the first verse, Judah is approaching Joseph, and he's saying, "Don't let your anger flare up. Don't let your anger flare up against us. I need to speak with you. But in the second one, it's not the brothers appealing to Joseph not to get angry. It's Joseph appealing to his brothers not to be angry at themselves. Now, we learned last week that Joseph is this amazing and incredible picture of Messiah. And if we think of Joseph in the light of Messiah in these two verses, there's a profound lesson here for you and me. In the first one, there's an appeal to Joseph, don't be angry with me. Forgive me, deliver me, hear me out. But in the second one, it's Joseph appealing to us, if you will, don't be angry at yourselves for what you did. So many times, and I wrestle with this myself, I confess to you. So many times we are quick to embrace God's forgiveness of us. And we accept His forgiveness and His grace, and we revel in it that He loves us and forgives us. But we have those nagging memories that the enemy keeps throwing up into our minds and into the forefront of our thoughts of something we said, something we did, something horrible that we were responsible for. And we just continue to feel guilty and more guilty about those things. And somehow it seems, for some of us at least, it's easier to accept God's forgiveness for what we've done than it is for us to let go of the things that we've done. For the bad decisions we've made, for our failures, for the times we didn't measure up. And these are the only two places where this Vayigash phrase is found. Right here in these two paragraphs, chapter 44 and chapter 45. And I think God's trying to drive home a message to us. I think He's saying, if I've forgiven you, are your standards somehow higher than mine? Are your standards so high that God, can forgive you, but you can't forgive yourself? You just have higher standards. He says, I've forgiven you. Quit beating yourself up for what you did, because what you meant for evil, or what you just did stupidly, I have somehow used for good. And as Robin and I shared in a recent Parsing the Portion teaching, we believe that in Revelation, when God wipes away all tears, it's not just a matter He says, okay, let's just forget about what's been done and let's just not cry about it. Let's quit moaning about the past and let's just move on because there's no more tears here now that you're in my new world. I don't think that's how it works. I think He wipes away our tears because He reveals how He used our failures to accomplish something for His kingdom. And we realize there's nothing to weep about. We'll be able to look, each of us, at our own past. Not just the things we did, but maybe the things done to us. And realize there's nothing to moan about. There's nothing to weep about. Because every single thing we did that was wrong or stupid or ignorant, God still used it somehow. Because that's the kind of God we have. So I hope you'll take this message to heart. You may just need to end the teaching right here and just ponder this and make a pact with God that you're no longer going to throw up into His face and allow yourself to just camp out and continue to dwell and stew about stuff that's done and gone and past and forgiven, and you just move on. I hope you can do that. Now there's another phrase in this verse. Let's read the verse again, Genesis 45:5. And now do not be distressed, do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For a life sustainer God sent me before you. That's a wonderful phrase. For a life sustainer. There's only one word in Hebrew. It's lamikia. And that lamed on the front is a preposition. It means for. And if we take that off, we're left with the word machaya. And machaya means not just life sustainer, but a resurrector. And I believe that Joseph, God, through this wording of Joseph, is again foreshadowing Messiah, who is the resurrector of the dead, who is the resurrection and the life. And this word Messiah is a word we find frequently in Jewish writings. And what I would like to do is read to you a portion of the Shemona Esrei. And I know a lot of you pray the Shemona Esrei, which is also called the Amidah, the 18-faceted blessing. Orthodox Jewish people pray this 3 times a day. And one of these 18 facets is the one about God's might. And listen to what it says. You are eternally mighty, my Lord. The Machaya Matim, the resurrector of the dead are you, with abundant power to save, who sustains the living with kindness. Machaya Matim resurrects the dead with abundant mercy, supports the fallen, heals the sick, releases the bound, and maintains his faith to those asleep in the dust. Who is like you, O Master of mighty deeds? And who is comparable to you, O King, who causes death and Machaya and resurrects and makes salvation, Yeshua is the Hebrew word, and makes Yeshua flourish. And you are faithful lechayot, to resurrect the dead. Blessed are you, Adonai, Machaya Hamatim, resurrector of the dead. So we find this word Machaya, or a form of the word, 5 times in this short blessing. It's the second one in the Shemona Esrei. And that's the word that's used here that Joseph applies to himself. And I think the Spirit is speaking through him, picturing Joseph to picture Yeshua as the resurrector of the dead, the Machaya Hamatim, the resurrector and the sustainer of Kai. Kai are those 2 letters there, Kof, Yud. Kai, life, L'chaim. And there is, you can see how the word is spelled in the Shemona Esrei, Machaya. There it is. In Genesis 46, verse 2, it says, And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. And so this is God speaking to Jacob and saying, Jacob, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, because this really is Joseph, your son. He's not dead. He is alive and well, and I have elevated him to be a ruler of the world and the sustainer of life, the Savior of the world. And the world is not starving to death right now because of your son, Joseph. And he says, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt and see him. Now, there's a book, a very ancient book called the Book of Tagin. Tagin are the little decorations on top of certain Hebrew letters in the Torah scroll. And one of the very first Hebrew key teachings I did was called Jots and Tittles, where I talk about the tittles, the Tagin, these decorations. And the Book of Tagin gives examples of the 190-some places in a Torah scroll where the decorations on the letters are put on in a very unique way. And in this word La Yisrael, to Israel, the shin, which is the 3rd letter, and not all Torah scrolls do this. When it comes to the Tagin, the scribe has freedom to follow these rules and traditions of Tagin or not. When it comes to other things like the letters themselves, oversized, undersized, and so on, the scribe has to follow the tradition. There's no room for innovation there. But when it comes to the decorations, he has some leeway. And some of these scribes get very decorative with the Tagin on these letters. But in the Book of Tagin, this ancient book about these 190-some places where unusual Tagin are put, it tells us that in this letter shin, in this word, in this verse here, in Genesis 46:2, the shin should have 7 Tagin on top. Now, if you can't see the shin because you're driving or whatever, I really encourage you to go to our website, which is TorahTodayMinistries.org. You can print out the notes. I have about 5 pages of notes here with the illustrations and references, and you can see what this looks like. But the shin looks like 3 stalks all coming together at the bottom. And here each stalk has, well, the first one has 3, and then the next one has 2, and the next one has 2, making a total of 7 tagin, or tittles, on top. So, of course, the rabbis ask, well, why do we have this tradition? And the tradition is that these 7 tagin, these 7 decorations, represent the 7 trials that Jacob went through. And oh my goodness, was his life filled with trial. And he has just now completed the 7th. And these are the 7 trials. Esau's hatred of him was a trial. Laban's deception when he swapped Leah for Rachel on his wedding night. The wrestling match was a trial. When he lost Joseph, this middle one here must have been by far the most difficult, because he spent the next 20 years or so just grieving over the loss of his beloved son. And then the rape of his daughter Dinah there in Shechem, in that horrible chapter. And then when the sons went down the first time and met Joseph, not knowing it was Joseph, Joseph kept Simeon behind as a captive. He basically kidnapped him to keep him as a ransom to make sure the brothers came back. That was a great trial for Jacob as well. And then when they went back again, Joseph had insisted they bring their little brother Benjamin. This was Joseph's only brother by his mother Rachel. And Benjamin was so precious to Jacob because he'd lost Joseph, but his little brother Benjamin, he was not going to let anything happen to him. But he finally had to let Benjamin go. And that was a great trial, a great test for Jacob. And those are the 7. But the next word that Jacob gets is that his son Joseph is alive, and God speaks to him, Jacob, Jacob, don't be afraid to descend down to Egypt and to see your son Joseph. What a day that must have been. Now, last week I shared with you 50 plus parallels between the life of Joseph and how it foreshadows Yeshua and his ministry. I want to share about another dozen of those with you from this week's Torah portion. In chapter 45, we see Joseph reveals himself to his brothers during 7 years of tribulation. And we know that in the coming tribulation is when the eyes of the Jewish people as a nation will be opened to recognize Yeshua as their Messiah. In verse 5, he reveals himself as the resurrection and the life. He's sent to procure a mighty deliverance. They approached the Father in the name of the Son. When they went back to their father Jacob, they came in the name of Joseph. And we go to the Father in the name of Yeshua, his only Son. He brings the Father's presence into the world, in verse 9. He gives to others what was taken from him. In verse 22, it tells us that Joseph gave changes of clothing to all of his brothers. They had taken his tunic, dipped it in blood, and presented the Father as proof that Joseph was dead. But Joseph is so forgiving. He gives them what was taken from him. He was thought dead, but he lives. He gives life to Jacob, whose name is also Israel. In verses 27 and 28, it says that Jacob's spirit came back to life. It revived. It's a picture of it. The language is like he almost rose from the dead. He gave him new life. In chapter 46, we see Israel established with favor in the world. In 47, we see Israel blesses the nations. He gives Israel a choice inheritance in the world. Excuse me. And in verse 25, we see a reference to him as the resurrector of the dead. So before I cough, I just want to wish you shalom and may God bless. And I look forward to seeing you next time for Parshah Seasonings.